One chilly autumn morning in 2006 began with an unusual disturbance on a dirt road in Ross County, Ohio. Three unmarked cars quietly pulled up in front of a simple wooden house standing isolated in the rural countryside. Neighbors peered through their curtains as investigators moved in an organized manner, positioning themselves around the area without drawing attention. Inside, Thomas Harper, 76 years old, was preparing his morning coffee, a routine he had maintained for more than half a century as a quiet and private man in the community. A sharp knock came at the door at 7:18 a.m. Thomas Harper, Ross County Sheriff's Office. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the disappearance of Evelyn Harper in 1952. Officers later noted that his hand trembled slightly as he set the coffee cup down, but his face remained strangely calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment for over half a century. Some names and details in this story have been changed to ensure anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene. In 1952, in Ross County, Ohio, a sparsely populated rural area where farms were far apart and dirt roads connected scattered houses amid fields and sparse woods, Evelyn Harper lived with her family in a small house situated in isolation, far from the town center and with few neighbors around. Her life proceeded steadily, with little variation and tied to repetitive daily activities. On the day of the incident, Evelyn carried out her familiar tasks, including going out during the day and returning to the home area in the late afternoon. There was no record indicating she encountered any trouble during her movements or any sudden change in her schedule. The last time Evelyn was seen was when she appeared near the family property, during a period when daylight was still sufficient to confirm her presence. After that point, no witness saw her leave the area or interact with anyone else. There was no sign that she had prepared to leave, such as packing clothes, taking personal items, or informing relatives or neighbors of any plans. Her essential daily items remained intact at the residence, including clothing, personal belongings, and other necessary items. When evening arrived and time passed without Evelyn returning home, the family began to realize her absence went beyond normal circumstances. They checked the areas around the house, including the front yard, backyard, outbuildings such as the shed and barn, and paths leading away from the property, while also looking for any signs that might indicate her direction of movement or recent presence. However, no clear traces were found. Thomas Harper, Evelyn's husband, provided information about the day's activities and suggested that Evelyn might have left after returning home, also mentioning the possibility that she had met a man he believed was involved, but this information was unverified and lacked independent witness confirmation at the time. As time continued to pass without any contact from Evelyn, including no return home, no messages, or appearance at any familiar locations, the family determined the situation had gone beyond explanations, such as personal travel or short-term plan changes. The disappearance was deemed unusual and concerning, leading the family to make the formal decision to contact law enforcement to report her as missing. Immediately after Evelyn Harper's family reported her disappearance in Ross County, Ohio, local law enforcement accepted the information and initiated an official missing person file according to standard procedures of 1952, systematically recording all initial data, including the victim's identity, residence address, family status, and the last confirmed time of presence. Thomas Harper, as the husband and the first person providing information, was identified as the primary witness. The marital relationship between him and Evelyn was clearly documented in the file to serve as context for assessing their living situation and the potential for an incident within the family. Investigators collected initial statements from Thomas in chronological order, asking him to describe the full sequence of events on the day of the incident, from the time Evelyn left the house until he noticed she was no longer present. Simultaneously, statements from other family members were also recorded to provide cross-reference and avoid total reliance on a single source. During his account, Thomas mentioned that Evelyn might have met an unfamiliar man before disappearing and possibly left with him, with a description of the man recorded including general characteristics such as appearance and the vehicle he supposedly used, though no specific name or verifiable identifying information was provided. Investigators noted this detail as a lead to verify, but also marked its reliability as undetermined. Next, investigators worked to establish the final timeline of when Evelyn was last seen, starting from her daytime activities, her return to the home area, and the last confirmation of her presence near the property. This information was compiled from family statements and related individuals, then arranged chronologically to form a detailed hour-by-hour timeline of the day. The timeline included key points such as when Evelyn was believed to have returned home, the period she was still in the living area, and the time after which no one saw her. In constructing the timeline, Thomas Harper was identified as the last person to have direct contact with Evelyn in the private family space, a factor marked as a critical point requiring further verification and deeper analysis. Investigators cross-checked Thomas's statements against others to assess consistency in timing and events, comparing every small detail from the last sighting of Evelyn to the activities claimed to have occurred afterward. Through comparison, some inconsistencies began to emerge, particularly regarding the timing of when Evelyn left the area. While these discrepancies were not yet large enough to draw conclusions, they were recorded as elements to monitor in subsequent steps. At the same time as analyzing statements, investigators conducted an overall scene survey, including both exterior and interior areas of the house. Outdoors, they examined the front yard, backyard, access paths, and surrounding land for signs of movement or anything unusual, but found no clear indicators such as fresh footprints, drag marks, or vehicle traces. Inside the house, investigators observed the overall layout, condition of doors, windows, and furnishings to determine if there were signs of external intrusion. No evidence suggested forced entry or signs of break-in, reducing the likelihood of an outsider entering by force at the time of the incident. However, during more detailed observation, some interior areas showed signs that did not fully align with normal living conditions, including slight rearrangements of items and a few spots with indications of disturbance without a clear specific cause. These details were not sufficient to immediately identify as signs of violence, but were recorded as anomalies requiring closer examination during the investigation. Additionally, investigators confirmed that Evelyn's important personal items remained at the house, with no indication she had prepared for a long absence, reinforcing the assessment that the disappearance occurred over a short period without prior preparation. During the process, Thomas was further asked to provide more information about the unfamiliar man he mentioned, including the context in which he believed Evelyn met this person and why he thought the man was connected to the disappearance. However, Thomas could not provide specific verifiable details, and no other witnesses confirmed the presence of a man matching the description in the area at the time. This detail continued to be kept in the file as a hypothesis requiring verification, but without supporting evidence. Based on the information recorded in the initial file, investigators shifted focus to verifying external factors to check the possibility that Evelyn Harper had left the area with another individual. The first step was to review the entire description provided by Thomas, including general appearance, identifying features, and the supposed vehicle involved. However, this description was broad, lacking specific identifiers such as a name, license plate, or distinctive traits that could distinguish him, making verification heavily dependent on finding independent witnesses in the surrounding area. Investigators collected statements from those living near the Harper property, including scattered households along the dirt roads and neighboring farms, focusing on whether anyone had seen an unfamiliar man in the area around the time corresponding to the established timeline. Questions centered on observations of strangers, unusual vehicles, or any unfamiliar activity on the day Evelyn disappeared. However, the collected results showed no witnesses confirming the appearance of a man matching Thomas's description. Most residents stated they observed no unusual activity in the area that day, and no one saw an unfamiliar vehicle stop or pass through the Harper property. In parallel with gathering statements, investigators examined the roads leading out of the area, including main routes and paths commonly used between farms, to determine whether a vehicle could have taken Evelyn away in a short window without being noticed. They assessed the geographic layout, including distances between houses, lines of sight from nearby positions, and residents' visibility in daylight conditions, comparing these to the specific time frame in the timeline from Evelyn's last sighting to when her presence was no longer confirmed. When evaluating the travel time required for a vehicle to approach, pick someone up, and depart undetected, investigators noted significant incompatibility between this hypothesis and the actual terrain, as any vehicle entering or leaving the property would have to pass roads observable by surrounding residents, especially in daylight, and no statements confirmed seeing such a vehicle in the relevant time frame. Additionally, investigators directly checked road surfaces and areas around the house for physical traces, including fresh tire marks, unusual ruts, or signs of a vehicle stopping briefly, but found no traces consistent with a vehicle approaching and departing on the day of the incident. The ground and road surfaces showed no corresponding disturbance from vehicle activity, further reducing the likelihood of an outside individual using a vehicle to take Evelyn from the area. At the same time, investigators continued cross-referencing details about the unfamiliar man with other sources, including checking whether anyone in the area had recently seen or interacted with someone of similar description, but results still recorded no confirmations. With no independent evidence supporting the existence of this man in the area's real context. When compiling the collected data, including neighbor statements, road checks, travel time analysis, and the absence of vehicle traces, investigators concluded that the hypothesis of Evelyn leaving the area with an unfamiliar man was not supported by any verifiable elements. Investigators shifted focus back to the victim's living space, conducting a detailed interior scene examination to determine whether signs indicated the incident occurred at the residence. The examination followed a sequence from overall to specific, beginning with the main living areas including the living room, bedroom, kitchen, and connecting pathways. Each area was carefully observed to assess the normal state of furnishings compared to possible signs of conflict or impact. Investigators checked floor surfaces in each area, noting indicators such as scuff marks, drag marks, or changes in surface texture that might suggest movement of heavy objects or struggle, while also examining walls for impact signs, like scratches, dents, or unusual color and texture variations, comparing these spots to the rest of the surfaces to gauge abnormality. Fixed furniture such as tables, chairs, cabinets, and beds was inspected for position and condition, with investigators noting whether items had been shifted from their usual places, showed signs of force, or exhibited any changes inconsistent with daily use. During this process, several unnatural disturbances were recorded more clearly than in the initial overall observation, including some objects no longer in their usual balanced positions and a few areas showing signs of force not corresponding to normal living activity. While these signs were not overly pronounced, when viewed in the overall context of the house, they formed a pattern suggesting a sudden disruption in the space. Investigators continued focusing on identifying potential impact zones based on the concentration of anomalies, narrowing down specific locations in the living space where disturbances, scratches, and furniture displacement appeared together. These areas were considered points of suspicion requiring deeper analysis. At these locations, examination was conducted more thoroughly, including detailed observation of contact surfaces, edges of objects, and distances between them to determine if there were signs of strong impact or struggle between two or more parties. Small details such as scratch directions or object misalignment were recorded to aid in reconstructing possible events. All locations with anomalies were marked and documented in the file, including precise position in the space, type of observed sign, and degree of difference from normal condition, with this marking intended to provide a basis for analyzing connections between signs and for cross-referencing with other investigation data. In parallel with identifying suspicious areas, investigators also checked all entry and exit points of the house, including the front door, back door, windows, and other access routes, aiming to determine if there were any signs of external intrusion. The inspection focused on the condition of locks, hinges, door frames, and any indications of forced opening or breaking, but no evidence was found of doors being forced or opened unlawfully. All entry points were in a condition consistent with normal use, with no signs of external tampering. This led to ruling out the possibility of an outside party entering the house by forceful means, while reinforcing the assessment that if an unusual event occurred, it was most likely within the closed space with the presence of individuals who had legitimate access to the home. From the areas previously marked with signs of disturbance and potential impact during the earlier detailed examination, investigators proceeded to the phase focused on searching for and collecting specific physical evidence to determine the nature of the event that occurred in the living space. At the suspicious locations, they began closely examining floor surfaces and surrounding areas to detect small objects that might have been overlooked during the initial overall observation. Among these, several spent shell casings were found scattered on the floor, their positions not random but showing a certain distribution within the previously identified area. Investigators collected each shell casing according to standard procedure, using appropriate tools to avoid altering the original condition of the evidence. Each casing was numbered, its exact location recorded, and placed into separate evidence bags to prevent cross-contamination or loss of information. The precise positioning of each shell casing was documented accurately, with investigators noting distances between casings, their relative positions to surrounding objects, and fixed points in the space, such as walls or large furniture. This information was used to create an evidence distribution diagram to aid in analyzing shooting direction and the position of the firearm user. At the same time, Near the locations where shell casings were found, investigators continued checking wall surfaces and adjacent objects for impact marks that might be related. During this process, several indicators were noted, such as small indentations on wooden surfaces, unusual scratches on walls or furniture, with characteristics consistent with high-velocity object impact, compatible with the possibility of firearm discharge. These marks were flagged and photographed for inclusion in the investigation file. When compiling the positions of the shell casings and corresponding impact marks, investigators observed that the evidence was not scattered throughout the entire space, but concentrated primarily in one specific area of the house. This indicated that the firearm-related event did not occur randomly, but had a clear focal point, an area that coincided with the previously identified disturbance signs, thereby establishing a connection between scene observations and collected evidence. All evidence after collection was entered into standard preservation procedures, including sealing, labeling, and storage under appropriate conditions for further analysis. Information regarding time, location, and collecting personnel was fully documented to ensure chain of custody continuity and to facilitate cross-referencing in later investigation stages. Investigators continued linking the evidence to the living space by correlating shell casing positions and impact marks with the house's spatial layout. They determined that this evidence was located in areas regularly used in daily living, not in seldom used or vacant spots, increasing the likelihood that the firearm-related event occurred in the context of normal daily activity rather than in an isolated or infrequently accessed area. Based on the established evidence distribution diagram, investigators conducted a detailed analysis of the spatial relationships between the shell casings and impact marks to reconstruct a sequence of events in the house. Each shell casing position was correlated with impact points on walls and furniture to identify distribution patterns. It was observed that the casings were not scattered in multiple directions, but clustered in a limited area with relatively close proximity to one another. This suggested that firearm use did not involve wide movement or loss of control, but tended to occur from a fixed position or within a very narrow range. When combined with the recorded impact marks, investigators determined shooting direction by analyzing the angle of indentations and scratches. These marks showed consistent directional similarity, indicating bullet trajectories followed a specific path from a particular origin point in the space, with no multi-directional dispersion or signs of multiple shooting sources, thereby reinforcing the conclusion that there was one primary shooting direction in the incident. From the established shooting direction, investigators inferred the relative position of the firearm user by correlating the shooting angle with average adult height and room layout. They identified a specific area where the shooter could have stood, an area providing direct line of sight to the impact mark locations and unobstructed by large objects. This position also aligned with the spot having the highest concentration of shell casings on the floor, showing compatibility between the shooter's position and the physical evidence left at the scene. Once the shooter's position was determined, investigators assessed the likelihood that the victim was present in the house at the time of the event. Based on the absence of signs of departure from the area and the intact personal belongings, they considered the possibility that Evelyn Harper was present in the living space when the firearm was discharged. Prior disturbance signs in this area were incorporated into the analysis to determine whether any interaction occurred before shots were fired. The repositioning of certain objects suggested possible sudden movement or brief impact in the space, although the exact nature of the interaction could not be clearly identified. These factors were consistent with a scenario in which the victim and the firearm user were both present in the same enclosed space at the time of the incident. Next, investigators evaluated the possibility of the firearm being used from outside the house by comparing the shooting direction with the structure of walls, doors, and windows to see if any external angle could produce the corresponding impact marks. However, the analysis showed the shooting direction did not align with any external approach path. There were no signs of penetration from outside inward, no marks on door frames or glass, indicating bullets passed through from outside, and the prior lack of forced entry signs further reduced this possibility. All factors pointed to the shooting origin being inside the living space. On the basis that firearm use occurred inside the house's living space, investigators moved to the step of directly examining potential related firearms, prioritizing those legally owned by individuals present in the house. Thomas Harper was asked to provide information about firearms he owned or kept on the premises. He confirmed possessing a personal firearm used for hunting and property protection, indicating its storage location within the residence. Investigators seized the firearm according to procedure, ensuring controlled collection to avoid altering its current condition while recording the exact location where it was found. including storage conditions and accessibility in daily life. After seizure, the firearm was examined for recent use signs by observing external and internal physical indicators, including barrel condition, chamber, and firing mechanism components. Investigators paid attention to signs of recent use, such as residue in the barrel, cleanliness or fouling of metal surfaces, and mechanical wear marks. Although forensic methods in 1952 were limited, direct observations still provided important indicators of recent discharge. Initial examination results showed the firearm exhibited signs of use within a period not distant from the incident time, recorded as a factor requiring cross-referencing with other file data. Next, investigators conducted a preliminary comparison between the seized firearm and evidence collected at the scene, particularly the shell casings. They compared caliber, shape, and bullet type with the ammunition used by this firearm. This comparison aimed to determine compatibility between the weapon and evidence. Characteristics of the casings, such as diameter, base shape, and overall structure, were checked for consistency with ammunition typically used in this firearm. Results showed similarity in ammunition type, meaning the collected casings could have been fired from a weapon similar to the one owned by Thomas Harper. Additionally, investigators recorded technical specifications of the firearm, including type, caliber, and operating mechanism, entering this information into the file for potential deeper comparison. Identifying matching ammunition type strengthened the link between the firearm and scene evidence, especially given the impact marks in casing distribution already indicating firearm use in an enclosed space. These elements combined to form a logical chain connecting the firearm, evidence, and scene. During examination, investigators also assessed the likelihood that this firearm was used in the event related to Evelyn Harper's disappearance. Based on ammunition compatibility, signs of recent use, and the firearm's accessible storage within the residence, they determined it had potential direct relevance to the incident. Although no final conclusion was reached, the level of compatibility among factors was sufficient to place the firearm on a list of key evidence requiring continued monitoring and analysis. All information related to seizure and examination was detailed in the file, including seizure time, discovery location, initial condition, and observation results. The firearm was then placed into preservation procedures similar to other evidence, sealed and stored appropriately to prevent alteration pending further analysis. Placing the firearm as critical evidence marked a significant step in the investigation, as elements related to firearm use in the living space began converging into a specific analytical direction linking the scene, evidence, and individuals with legitimate access to firearms in the house. The investigative team launched a large-scale search operation to locate Evelyn Harper or any traces related to movement after the incident. The search plan was organized by zones, initially focusing on the area surrounding the house, including the entire family-owned property, adjacent areas, and paths leading away from the main living space. Participating personnel were specifically assigned to ensure systematic coverage. Each zone was subdivided for detailed inspection to avoid missing small signs obscured by the natural environment. The search began closest to the house, covering the front yard, backyard, walkways, and surrounding open land. Investigators examined ground surfaces for signs of disturbance, such as fresh digging, unusual depressions, or indications of heavy objects being placed or dragged. They also checked bushes, fences, and areas that could obstruct visibility, but found no clear signs of a body or burial activity in the immediate vicinity. After completing the near-house area without results, the search expanded to farther zones, including sparse woods, dirt roads leading away, and low-lying areas prone to water accumulation or terrain concealment. These areas were considered possible for body concealment due to low traffic and limited visibility from afar. Search teams swept each zone in formation to cover the full area, using basic tools to probe surface soil and natural obstacles. During the search, investigators paid particular attention to potential body hiding spots, including natural depressions, ditches, dense vegetation areas, or low terrain. They closely inspected these for recent intervention signs such as disturbed soil, trampled vegetation, or non-natural objects, but detected no clear indications of a concealed or abandoned body in these zones. In addition to natural environment searches, investigators examined all outbuildings on the property, including sheds, barns, storage areas, and any structures potentially used for concealment. Each was inspected from exterior to interior, with corners, seldom used spots, and shielded positions thoroughly checked. But no signs of a body or related evidence were found in these structures. At the same time, investigators examined the private land around the house for possible burial sites, observing ground surfaces for recent digging, soil color changes, or inconsistent texture that might indicate concealment, but no clear signs emerged during this inspection. An important part of the search involved checking for signs of heavy object movement. Investigators looked for drag marks on the ground, weight-induced depressions, or vegetation changes that might indicate large object transport direction. They examined main and secondary paths, soft surface areas, and sections likely to retain traces, but found no clear drag marks and no evidence of a heavy object moved through the area recently. When compiling results from the entire search operation, including near-house areas, woods, dirt roads, low-lying zones, outbuildings, and private land, investigators concluded there were no signs indicating Evelyn Harper's body was present within the search perimeter, nor any clear physical traces showing she left the area by vehicle or traveled through surrounding routes. The absence of drag marks, footprints, or vehicle traces further supported the assessment that any movement, if it occurred, was done in a way that left no easily detectable traces or took place beyond the searched scope. At the same time, the lack of any evidence that Evelyn voluntarily left the area, combined with prior data showing no witnesses to strangers or vehicles, reduced the likelihood that the victim departed willingly or was immediately removed from the area by ordinary means. The lack of results from the large-scale search operation forced investigators to shift their attention to the human element, particularly individuals present at the scene around the time of the victim's disappearance, with Thomas Harper becoming the primary subject of close scrutiny due to his role as the last person confirmed to have contact with Evelyn Harper and as the main source of initial information. Observations of his behavior and reactions were systematically recorded to assess their consistency with the context of an unusual missing person case. Through direct interactions, investigators noted that Thomas's approach did not demonstrate proactive efforts to seek information or assist the investigation in an expansive manner. Instead, he maintained a restricted stance, focusing on certain specific details without developing other possibilities. A notable point recorded was his failure to participate in organized search activities around the residence area. Despite being the person with the clearest knowledge of the terrain and locations that might need checking, his absence from search teams persisted throughout the review process, creating a significant difference from the typical behavior of close relatives in similar cases, where they usually participate directly or at least closely follow search efforts. This limited involvement was documented as a factor requiring consideration in the overall behavioral assessment. The manner in which he provided information was also analyzed for completeness and objectivity. Investigators observed that Thomas tended to present events in a specific direction, emphasizing the possibility that Evelyn had left with an unidentified man. This detail was repeated across multiple exchanges, but lacked accompanying verifiable specifics. He could not provide a name, address, or any identifying elements to support independent verification, making the information more directional than factual and limiting the scope of analysis unless cross-checked with other sources. When asked to clarify timelines related to the day of the incident, Thomas often gave approximate answers lacking precision on specific times. The described time periods were inconsistent across presentations, with minor variations sufficient to create discrepancies when compared to other collected data. The lack of temporal detail not only reduced verifiability but also complicated accurate sequencing of events. Investigators noted a pattern of avoiding specific information when questions probed sensitive timeframes. Additionally, the way Thomas shaped the content of exchanges showed signs of actively steering the narrative. He not only answered questions but also offered assertions reinforcing his stated hypothesis, focusing on external factors while downplaying elements within the home. The repetition of unconfirmed details combined with a failure to expand into other possibilities created a one-sided information pattern, especially in the context of scene data and verification results that did not support the involvement of a stranger. Summarizing the behavioral factors related to Thomas including non-participation in searches, directional information provision, inconsistencies in time descriptions, and avoidance of detail, investigators identified a behavioral pattern inconsistent with that expected from a close relative facing an unusual disappearance. These observations did not constitute direct evidence, but when combined with existing scene data and physical evidence, contributed to a basis for examining Thomas Harper's role more deeply in the investigation process, placing him at the center of hypotheses requiring verification. Investigators systematized all information by factor groups, including physical traces in the living space, search results showing no body recovery, and behavioral characteristics of directly involved individuals, thereby creating a data structure allowing logical and sequential evaluation of connections among these elements. When examining scene evidence, particularly the presence of shell casings in the living area and impact marks consistent with bullet strikes, investigators determined these could not be explained by normal activity. The signs indicated firearm use in an enclosed space with shooting direction and position relatively clearly established, leading to the hypothesis that serious violent behavior had occurred inside the house. The homicide hypothesis formed on the basis of this physical evidence, as the victim's disappearance lacked any signs of voluntary departure and no proof supported external involvement. Investigators assessed that the likelihood of the victim being attacked within the living space best fit the available data, especially since scene indicators concentrated in one specific area without spreading to others. Continuing analysis in this direction, investigators evaluated the possibility that the victim's body had been disposed of after the event. The failure to locate the body during comprehensive searches, including immediate and expanded areas, suggested that if concealment occurred, it was executed to minimize detectable traces. They considered options such as moving the body shortly after the incident, using vehicles or methods to avoid detection, or transporting it beyond the initial search perimeter. The absence of drag marks or heavy object movement signs in the near area was factored in, indicating possible disposal without leaving obvious surface terrain evidence. In building the hypothesis, investigators focused on identifying individuals with direct potential involvement. Thomas Harper continued to be evaluated based on his position as the last person to contact the victim, his access to the space where anomalies appeared, and his access to a firearm matching the found ammunition type. These elements were linked to assess fit between the individual and the scene, while previously recorded behavioral traits were incorporated, including non-participation in searches, directional information provision, and inconsistencies in time descriptions. These factors, in overall context, formed a behavioral pattern inconsistent with someone uninvolved. From this data, investigators identified Thomas Harper as the primary suspect in the homicide hypothesis, with potential direct involvement in firearm use inside the house and possible participation in subsequent body handling. However, this determination rested on indirect elements and logical inference without direct evidence confirming specific actions. Investigators noted that although the existing factors formed a reasonable chain of connections, significant gaps remained in proof, particularly the absence of a body to establish cause of death, no direct eyewitness to the event, and no forensic results available at the time to link the firearm to criminal action. The evidentiary gaps identified during hypothesis construction forced investigators to confront systemic limitations of investigative work in 1952, when forensic science methods were rudimentary and unable to provide the precise analytical tools available in later periods. One of the most significant limitations was the absence of DNA technology, making biological linkage between victim, scene, and suspect virtually impossible. Any collected samples could not be analyzed scientifically for identity or origin, severely impacting confirmation of injury or killing at the scene and direct individual linkage to the act through biological traces. Additionally, the failure to identify biological traces such as blood, tissue, or related substances in the living space greatly reduced the ability to reconstruct events. Detection methods at the time relied primarily on naked eye observation, without chemical techniques or specialized lighting to reveal cleaned or obscured traces, meaning many potentially important signs may have existed but gone unrecorded or unconfirmed, thereby undermining the reliability of scene-based conclusions. Furthermore, the lack of precise scene reconstruction technology was a major constraint. Investigators could not employ modern simulation methods to accurately determine bullet paths, individual positions in the space, or event sequences, instead relying on manual analysis combining physical observation and logical inference. This introduced potential for error, especially with incomplete or unclear traces. Determining shooting direction, shooter position, and events in an enclosed space could only reach a relative level, insufficient for absolute conclusions. In the context of these technological and methodological limitations, the investigation became heavily dependent on inference and statements from involved parties. Investigators had to cross-reference information from various sources, evaluating consistency and reasonableness of statements to build an overall picture. However, subjective statements could be influenced by memory, perception, or intent, reducing reliability when used as primary grounds for conclusions, particularly with contradictions or lack of specifics. The absence of sufficiently strong physical evidence to support or refute statements complicated evaluation and hindered achieving necessary certainty. These combined factors created a major limitation in transitioning from investigative hypothesis to legal basis for charges. Although available data supported a reasonable hypothesis structure of violent behavior in the house and Thomas Harper's potential involvement, investigators lacked sufficient direct evidence to prove criminal conduct to legal standards, no body to establish cause of death, no scientific forensic results linking the firearm to the act, and no direct eyewitness confirming the event. These methodological and technological limitations placed the entire investigation in a state reliant on indirect factors, while key data needed to transform hypothesis into conclusion could not be supplemented. The greatest deficiency centered on the failure to locate Evelyn Harper's body, creating a serious gap in the file since cause of death could not be determined, time of death could not be established, and no form of examination could link victim to scene. The absence of a body meant no direct physical basis to prove a homicide had actually occurred, despite scene signs making it plausible. Concurrently, the lack of direct eyewitnesses to the event further increased uncertainty. The entire sequence was inferred from physical traces and indirect statements, with no individual able to confirm witnessing violence, hearing gunshots, or observing a specific chain of events in the house at the time. The absence of direct witnesses forced all conclusions to rely on logical inference rather than factual confirmation, significantly weakening the file in a legal context. Investigators continued reviewing all collected evidence, including shell casings, impact marks, and the firearm owned by Thomas Harper. While these indicated firearm use in the living space, none directly proved the weapon was used to cause Evelyn Harper's death. No biological traces linking the victim to a specific house position. No forensic results confirming bullets fired in an event involving the victim. These elements only showed abnormal behavior occurred, insufficient to confirm its nature and consequences. Meanwhile, assessment of Thomas Harper's behavior, though revealing numerous anomalies and inconsistencies, could not serve as direct evidence for charges. Behavioral traits such as non-participation in searches, directional information provision, and avoidance of detailed time answers held supportive value for the investigative hypothesis but failed to meet criminal proceeding proof standards. The lack of physical or direct testimonial elements linking him to specific conduct meant suspicion, despite logical basis, could not become formal accusation. Summarizing all factors, investigators recognized a clear gap in the case file between level of suspicion and level of proof. The homicide hypothesis with Thomas Harper as primary suspect could be reasonably constructed from available data, but lacked sufficient evidence to surpass the legal threshold for prosecution. Pursuing charges in this context risked inability to sustain them in court due to missing core elements such as a body, direct witnesses, and forensic evidence, forcing investigators to reassess the feasibility of continuing the investigation with existing resources and methods. In the context where the entire investigative direction could not progress further due to the lack of core proving elements, investigators were forced to adjust a case file status according to the operational procedures of that time. The case involving Evelyn Harper's disappearance was reclassified to an unresolved status, with the unresolved designation accurately reflecting the reality that existing data was insufficient to reach a final legal conclusion. This process was not a complete termination decision, but an official acknowledgement that investigative efforts under current conditions had reached their limit and could not be expanded without additional information or new supportive means. Investigators compiled the entire file, including scene reports, evidence collection records, statement transcripts, spatial diagrams, analysis notes, and all related documents generated throughout the investigation. Each section was reviewed to ensure completeness and consistency, with any missing or unverified points clearly noted for potential future re-examination. The file was organized in a logical structure, allowing any subsequent reviewer to understand the investigative progression and conclusions reached at each stage. Collected physical evidence, including shell casings, the firearm, and related items, was placed into long-term preservation procedures with storage standards designed to maintain original condition. Although advanced analysis methods were not yet available at the time, investigators noted the potential that future developments in forensic science could enable re-examination of this evidence, so preservation was carried out with high caution to avoid altering or losing any potentially valuable characteristics. Alongside evidence storage, the entire paper file was transferred to the law enforcement agency's archival system, labeled and categorized by case code for retrieval when needed. Investigators clearly documented the constructed hypotheses, pursued investigative directions, and reasons why those directions could not lead to a final conclusion. To prevent repetition of completed steps if the file were reopened later, and to provide a foundational information base for other investigators to continue without starting from scratch. Legally, due to insufficient evidence to establish a specific crime, no prosecution was initiated against any involved individual. Thomas Harper, though remaining the primary suspect in internal analysis, faced no formal charges due to the lack of legal basis. This reflected the fundamental principle of the justice system that any accusation must be supported by evidence strong enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. When this standard was not met, prosecution could not proceed. Investigators clearly recorded this status in the file while maintaining informal monitoring in case new information emerged. After the file was placed into long-term archival status, all active investigative activity ceased, and the case gradually receded from the daily operational priorities of the law enforcement agency. No new reports emerged, no additional witnesses appeared, and no further evidence was discovered that could alter the recorded hypothesis structure. In the following years, the case file existed in the system as an unresolved matter, preserved alongside other documents, and accessed only during periodic reviews or upon external new information. However, over a long period, no signals indicated the emergence of new data valuable enough to reactivate the investigation. As time passed, the surrounding context of the case also changed. Initially surveyed areas gradually underwent terrain alterations due to farming activities, construction, or natural factors, reducing the likelihood of preserving any remaining traces. Potential witnesses, if any, gradually lost the ability to recall details accurately, with memory affected by time making any later statements prone to reduced reliability. These factors made reconstructing events even more difficult than at the outset. Meanwhile, Thomas Harper continued living in the area without any legal constraints related to the case. With no formal charges, he maintained his daily routine, participated in community activities, and faced no special oversight from authorities beyond being noted in the file as an individual connected to an unresolved case. His presence in the area prompted no intervention from law enforcement, as there was no legal basis for restrictions or supplemental investigation. Over time, the original investigators also changed. Some transferred, some retired, leading to direct case knowledge no longer being maintained within the same group of individuals. The file became the sole primary source reflecting the entire prior investigative process, increasing the importance of detailed and complete archiving, but also creating a gap between data and personnel, as later reviewers could only rely on documents rather than direct experience. Throughout many years, the case saw no significant progress, with no events altering the established, unresolved status. Hypotheses remained in the file but unverified further. Evidence stayed in storage without deeper analysis due to technological limitations at the time. The entire case existed as a typical example of the disconnect between suspicion and proof, where logical elements were insufficient to transform into legal action. With no new developments over many years, the entire file related to Evelyn Harper continued to exist in the law enforcement agency's physical storage system. Paper documents were organized by content groups, including initial reports, scene records, spatial diagrams, statements from involved individuals, and investigators' analysis notes, all bound into sets and stored in the archive under the previously assigned case code. Evidence such as shell casings and the firearm was preserved separately in sealed boxes, accompanied by identification labels to ensure traceability when needed. This storage followed procedures aimed at maintaining the integrity of documents and evidence over extended periods, although at the time there were no specific plans for their near-future reuse. No regular review mechanism was applied to this file during that phase due to resource and methodological limitations. Unresolved cases were typically re-examined only upon external new information or special requests from superiors. This resulted in Evelyn Harper's file not being reanalyzed for a long time, with no cross-referencing of data, no rechecking of constructed hypotheses, and no updates to investigative approaches. The entire file content remained unchanged from the time it was closed. Physical storage also imposed certain access limitations. Documents could only be reviewed in person at the archive, with no digitized copies to facilitate analysis or sharing across units. This reduced the ability of a new investigative team to quickly access and comprehend the case structure, as all information depended on rereading original documents where handwritten notes or inconsistent presentation could complicate interpretation. especially when original creators were no longer involved in later reviews. Evidence, though preserved to standards of the time, was not re-inspected throughout the storage period, with no reassessment of condition or analytical potential as technology evolved. This meant the evidence's potential to provide new information went unexploited. It existed as static proof with referential value in the file, rather than as dynamic data for continued investigation. During this period, the case file was not incorporated into any systematic review program, with no prioritization or reclassification to identify cases potentially reopenable based on new criteria. The absence of such a mechanism kept the case in an unnoticed state despite lingering suspicious elements in the file content. No activities aimed to reassess the case's significance or solvability in the changing context of forensic science and investigative methods. The entire archiving process occurred passively, with the file maintained without intervention or updates. In 2006, changes in the approach to unresolved cases created conditions for re-examination of old files. A specialized unit for cold cases, commonly called the Cold Case Unit, was established with the task of reviewing unsolved matters based on advancements in investigative methods and forensic technology. During the classification of archive files, Evelyn Harper's case was included in the review list due to its complete scene documentation, clear suspicion of violent behavior, and the prior identification of a suspect without sufficient basis for prosecution. These criteria made the case a suitable candidate for re-evaluation. Upon receiving the file, the Cold Case Unit conducted an initial review process to determine the completeness and re-exploitability of the materials. The entire physical file was retrieved from storage and reorganized into a more modern structure, with documents reclassified by functional groups such as scene, evidence, statements, and prior analysis to enable systematic access. New investigators began rereading each report, cross-referencing notes and diagrams to reconstruct the original investigative progression in detail. They examined not only content, but also the manner in which conclusions had been reached, identifying strengths and weaknesses in prior approaches. During the review, the Cold Case Unit paid particular attention to preserved evidence, inspecting the condition of shell casings and the firearm while assessing the applicability of modern forensic techniques unavailable previously. This included considering microtrace analysis on casings, firearm use indicators, and the potential to detect biological traces previously unidentifiable. Concurrently, scene-related documents were reanalyzed with fresh perspectives. Spatial diagrams and evidence positions were used to reconstruct context using more advanced methods, allowing more accurate evaluation of shooting direction, shooter position, and the likelihood of events in an enclosed space. Reviewing all old documents also included recross-checking recorded statements. Investigators assessed the consistency of statements across multiple provisions, identifying contradictions or logical gaps that may not have been fully exploited earlier. Thomas Harper's statements were particularly reanalyzed in the overall context of scene and evidence data, with previously noted behavioral factors incorporated to determine alignment with better understood criminal behavior patterns in the present time. In the selection and review process, the Cold Case Unit not only sought new evidence, but also focused on identifying unexploited points in the old file. They evaluated whether any collected data had untapped potential, or if hypotheses had been dismissed too prematurely due to methodological limitations of the time. This required a comprehensive reanalytical approach, not merely repeating old steps, but posing new questions based on modern knowledge and technology. When the entire file had been restructured and clearly categorized by data groups, the Cold Case Unit began delving deeply into the reanalysis phase, with a focus on checking the internal consistency of the previously collected information. They conducted cross-comparison of old statements by placing each statement record side by side in chronological order to identify changes in presentation and content, with particular emphasis on Thomas Harper's statements given a central role in the entire sequence of events. This process went beyond mere rereading to include breaking down specific details, such as times, actions, and locations into separate data units, then reorganizing them to verify whether these elements maintained consistency across multiple statements. The results revealed that certain time points were adjusted in a way that minimized the period Thomas was near the victim. Some details about daily activities were added later compared to the initial statement, and certain segments of information were rephrased in ways that altered the original meaning without clear explanation. These points were recorded as internal contradictions, not minor memory lapses, but systematic changes directly related to key elements of the case. Continuing from the identification of statement contradictions, investigators reevaluated the scene based solely on archived documents, using spatial diagrams, scene photographs, and evidence positions to reconstruct the context with more modern analytical tools. Although returning to the original scene was impossible, modeling methods allowed them to redetermine the relative positions of shell casings, shooting direction, and impact points with greater accuracy. This data was input into an analysis system to calculate bullet trajectories, thereby inferring the shooter's position in the space. The results indicated that the shots originated from a fixed area inside the house, with shooting angle and height consistent with targeting an individual in the same space, showing no signs of shots fired from outside or penetrating surfaces from a distance. This ruled out an external event and reinforced the conclusion that violent behavior occurred in an enclosed space. Investigators continued linking the scene analysis results with statement contradictions to reconstruct the event sequence, determining that changes in Thomas's statements directly related to the period when violent behavior was believed to have occurred. The inability to provide a stable and consistent timeline suggested possible information adjustment to obscure or blur a critical time frame. When placed in the context of scene evidence showing firearm use, investigators assessed that these two factors supported each other, forming a logical structure in which behavior and physical evidence both pointed to the same hypothesis. Based on these analyses, the homicide hypothesis was strengthened not only by inference, but also by restructuring data into a more rigorous system. Investigators determined that no evidence in the file supported the possibility of the victim leaving voluntarily or being taken by an external party. All scene elements concentrated in the living space, with no signs of forced entry and no traces of movement away from the area. When combined with Thomas being the last person to contact the victim and having access to a matching firearm, this formed a highly logical chain of connections, placing him at the center of the investigative hypothesis. Alongside strengthening the hypothesis, the cold case unit also identified weaknesses in the original investigation to avoid repeating prior limitations. They noted that although 1952 investigators had collected much important information, the lack of a comprehensive analysis system prevented effective linkage of that data. Statement contradictions were not systematized into strong indirect evidence. Scene analysis remained descriptive without deep event reconstruction, and collected evidence was not fully exploited due to technological constraints. These weaknesses were recorded as elements to address in the reinvestigation, with investigators building a new analytical framework in which each piece of data was placed into a clear linkage system, enabling cross-checking among factors and minimizing the risk of overlooking important information. When the reanalysis process had clarified contradictions and strengthened the hypothesis structure, new information began to emerge during the expanded review. This source did not come from the old file but from supplemental data related to a specific area located far from the original house site, an area not thoroughly checked during the 1952 search scope due to terrain conditions and resource limits. The new information pointed to the possible existence of a burial site in a low-lying land area near a sparsely traveled dirt road. Investigators assessed the reliability of this information by cross-referencing it with existing data, including the feasibility of body transport within the established time frame, terrain suitability for concealment, and the prior absence of search activity in that area. After determining the information had sufficient basis for verification, the cold case unit organized an on-site survey at the suspected location. The area inspection was conducted systematically. Investigators marked the survey boundaries, observed ground surfaces for anomalies such as soil texture changes, vegetation differences, or signs of prior disturbance, and used modern support tools to detect subsurface structural variations, thereby identifying a specific point with indicators consistent with burial. This area was flagged and prepared for controlled excavation. The excavation proceeded step by step, beginning with careful removal of the surface soil layer to avoid damaging any potential evidence beneath. As soil was gradually removed, investigators began detecting initial signs of non-natural materials, including fabric fragments and materials with textures differing from the surrounding environment. The process continued until skeletal remains started to emerge. The position and condition of these parts were meticulously recorded before deeper excavation proceeded. The entire area was treated as a new crime scene, with full documentation and preservation protocols. Once the remains were clearly exposed, investigators recovered them in a controlled manner, preserving the relative positions of bones and associated materials. During this process, they also collected surrounding wrapping materials, including a partially decomposed rug and other items possibly used for concealment. These were documented for position, condition, and relation to the remains, then packaged separately for forensic examination. Recovery followed standards to ensure no loss of traces that could provide key information on concealment method and timing. After the remains were brought to the surface, forensic experts conducted a preliminary on-site examination to determine basic characteristics, including sex, estimated age, and identifiable morphological features. Initial results indicated the remains belonged to a female individual with characteristics matching Evelyn Harper's information. Bone indicators were also noted to assess possible pre-death trauma, though detailed determination required laboratory work. The entire set of remains and related materials was transferred to a forensic facility for detailed analysis, including cleaning, sorting, and examining each bone fragment, while applying modern forensic techniques to confirm identity. Samples were taken for comparison with available data, including dental records, if any, and other identifying information stored in the old file. The examination also focused on bone trauma signs to clarify cause of death. Forensic results confirmed that the discovered remains were those of Evelyn Harper, based on the match between the biological characteristics of the remains and the victim's personal records, including sex, age, and other identifying features. The confirmation of Evelyn Harper's remains not only closed a gap persisting for decades, but also created a physical foundation for investigators to tightly link the body discovery site to the original house scene. They began by establishing a detailed geographic comparison model, placing the burial location in relation to the house, dirt roads, and surrounding terrain features. Distances were precisely measured and cross-referenced with the time frame the suspect could have moved without notice. Factors such as slope, vegetation cover, and vehicle access were analyzed to assess transport feasibility. The results showed the discovery area was within direct reachable range from the house in a short period, while sufficiently isolated to avoid detection under 1952 conditions, creating clear compatibility between the burial site and the originally established timeline limits. From this basis, investigators evaluated body transport feasibility based on the condition and structure of the remains upon discovery. They noted that bone fragments were not randomly scattered but relatively concentrated, indicating the body had been placed rather than discarded uncontrollably. Bone positioning and arrangement signs suggested deliberate intervention during concealment, cross-referenced with the hypothesis that the body had been wrapped prior to movement. Investigators analyzed manual versus vehicular transport possibilities based on estimated body weight and required distance, determining vehicular use as the most reasonable option to minimize ground traces, explaining the absence of drag marks near the house in the original investigation. A key linking element between the two scenes was the recovered wrapping materials. The rug and related items underwent detailed forensic analysis, with experts examining fiber structure, weave pattern, and decomposition level to determine origin. Results were compared to old file descriptions of items in Thomas Harper's living area, particularly records of a similar rug once present in the house. The similarity in material, size, and structural features created a direct connection between the wrapping materials and property linked to the suspect, proving not only that the body was wrapped before burial but also indicating the material's source, thereby connecting disposal behavior to the original living space. Investigators continued reconstructing the disposal method based on confirmed data, determining that the process involved organized steps, beginning with wrapping to limit biological or physical trace transfer during movement, followed by selecting an isolated yet quickly accessible burial site, and finally burying at sufficient depths to avoid long-term detection. These elements were analyzed in relation to actual area conditions and the capability of an individual familiar with the terrain, showing disposal behavior was not random reaction, but a calculated sequence aimed at minimizing detection risk. When all elements were placed into a unified analysis system, investigators strengthened the event chain, from violent behavior in the house to body transport and burial. They determined that original scene data, evidence, and body discovery location did not exist independently, but formed a logical linked structure in which each element supported the others. Compatibility between burial site and timeline movement feasibility. Material similarity between wrapping and suspect property, along with scene signs indicating enclosed space violence. When the event sequence from the original scene to the burial site had been linked into a clear logical structure, investigators shifted to analyzing Thomas Harper's behavior after Evelyn's disappearance to determine its fit with the strengthened hypothesis. They began by re-reviewing all recorded actions in the file from the missing person report onward, focusing on Thomas's reactions and interactions with authorities and those around him. The data showed he provided initial information, but in a manner not reflective of events and tending to steer the listener's perception. From the start, he introduced the unfamiliar man as a primary possibility despite no supporting evidence. Assessed as proactive creation of an alternative explanation to divert investigative focus from the living space where anomalies had been recorded. Alongside directional information provision, investigators examined signs of possible scene alteration. Although no direct records of cleanup or trace removal appeared in the original file due to detection method limitations, the absence of clear biological traces in a space showing firearm use was deemed inconsistent with typical violent event outcomes, leading to the assumption of intervention to reduce detectability. Such behavior could include moving objects, repositioning furniture, or treating surfaces to eliminate victim scene links. These factors were placed in the short time window between disappearance and authorities' scene access, indicating opportunity for intervention by someone present. Investigators continued analyzing how Thomas maintained and adjusted information throughout the original investigation, noting that the narrative of the victim leaving with someone else was not only introduced once, but repeated and reinforced across multiple sessions, with each provision adding details to increase persuasiveness, yet these details lacked evidence basis and shifted to fit questioning context. This was assessed as sustained maintenance of an alternative story over time to create a stable information structure resistant to doubt. Investigators determined that prolonged repetition of inaccurate information could influence other witnesses' recollections, thereby reducing objective information gathering potential. Additionally, avoidance of specific time details was analyzed as a key factor. Thomas's statements often lacked clear time markers or changed when clarification was requested, creating timeline gaps not fully exploited earlier. When combined with scene analysis showing violence within a specific period, the lack of precise Thomas activity during that window became noteworthy. Investigators assessed that maintaining time ambiguity could be a means to avoid direct cross-referencing with evidence-established events. From synthesizing these factors, the cold case unit constructed a post-event behavioral model in which Thomas's actions formed a linked sequence: initial information steering, potential scene intervention to reduce traces, and long-term maintenance of an alternative narrative to create protective layers against suspicion. This model was cross-referenced with confirmed physical data, including scene, evidence, and body location, with results showing high fit between behavior and physical elements, as behavior explained how traces could have been altered or undetected initially, while accounting for the lack of accurate event information in early statements. Investigators used this analysis to further strengthen the suspect event linkage, relying not only on physical data, but also on behavior alignment with long-term crime concealment. From the established behavioral model and linked physical elements, the investigative team expanded scope by seeking additional witnesses who might provide previously unrecorded information. They re-reviewed lists of those living or present in the area in 1952, approaching individuals not previously interviewed or those whose prior statements had not been deeply explored. This process was systematic, with questions reframed based on the reconstructed timeline to elicit possibly overlooked or under-considered details in the original context. During new statement collection, some witnesses began providing information related to unusual sounds on the night of the incident, sounds previously unrecorded or deemed insignificant, but now more relevant in current context. Witnesses described hearing loud noises from near Evelyn's house, inconsistent with normal activities and occurring within the timeline gap identified. Investigators documented details on timing, intensity, and direction of the sounds, then cross-referenced with terrain structure to assess sound propagation in the area. Results showed these descriptions aligned with loud sounds potentially originating inside the house and spreading to surroundings under rural, quiet conditions. Alongside suspicious sounds, new statements also mention unusual movements in the same period. Some witnesses recalled seeing or hearing a vehicle moving on nearby dirt roads at hours inconsistent with normal activity. Descriptions included a vehicle leaving the house area at night and heading toward isolated regions. This information was recorded and compared to routes potentially leading to the discovered burial site, with results showing matches in direction and distance, increasing linkage between new statements and confirmed physical data. Investigators cross-referenced all supplemental statements with the reconstructed old timeline, placing new information into specific time points for fit verification. Recorded sounds aligned with the period scene evidence indicated possible violent behavior, while vehicle movements fit the subsequent period, consistent with body transport hypothesis. This alignment not only reinforced timeline reasonableness, but also added independent external confirmation factors. Investigators assessed that although these statements came after many years, when placed in the reanalyzed data context, they held value in confirming inferences from scene and evidence. Additionally, new statement collection allowed rechecking reliability of initial information. Comparing new statements to prior records revealed some key details, unexploited or undervalued in the original investigation, possibly due to the lack of a comprehensive analysis structure at the time. The addition of new statements with details aligning with the reconstructed timeline enabled investigators to move into the evidence synthesis phase, where all data from the original scene, body discovery location, and statements were integrated into a unified analysis system to establish direct connections among the elements. They began by combining physical traces in the living space with forensic results from the remains, shooting direction indicators, shell casing positions, and impact areas in the house were cross-referenced with trauma signs on the skeleton. Although the long time lapse limited some details, the compatibility between firearm use in an enclosed space and the recorded injuries created a logical link between the scene and the body, further strengthened by the discovery of the remains along with wrapping materials originating from the suspect's living area. From that foundation, investigators integrated the supplemental statements into the evidence structure. Information about unusual nighttime sounds was placed within the period when scene evidence indicated possible violent behavior, while records of vehicle movements were positioned in the subsequent phase, consistent with the hypothesis of body transport and burial. The alignment among these independent data sources allowed investigators to determine that the events were not merely inferred from physical evidence, but also supported by real-world external observations, increasing the reliability of the event chain when viewed holistically. With the elements linked, investigators detailed the criminal behavioral sequence, reconstructing the order beginning with violent behavior in the house based on scene signs of enclosed space firearm use, followed by post-event handling including wrapping the body with available living area materials to limit traces, then transporting the body by vehicle to an isolated yet quickly accessible location, and finally, burying it at sufficient depth to evade long-term detection. Each step in this behavioral chain was supported by at least one data type from evidence and scene to statements, forming a tightly interconnected structure. During synthesis, investigators also eliminated previously considered alternative hypotheses. They re-evaluated the possibilities of the victim leaving voluntarily or being taken by an external party. But no file evidence supported these scenarios. The absence of departure preparation signs, lack of witnesses confirming another individual's presence, and no traces of outward movement significantly reduced the feasibility of those hypotheses, while scene and remains data pointed to an entirely different sequence involving enclosed space violence and deliberate body relocation. The incompatibility between alternative hypotheses and existing data allowed investigators to exclude them from the analytical framework. With unsuitable hypotheses removed, the case structure was rebuilt into a complete model in which each data element occupied a specific position in the event chain. Investigators established a linkage system among scene, remains, evidence, and statements, ensuring every conclusion drew support from multiple independent sources. This structure not only described what occurred, but also explained the methods and sequence of each action while identifying the suspect's role at every stage, from the violent act to body handling and concealment. Once the case structure had been established with clear linkages among scene, remains, and statements, the investigative team shifted to building the prosecution file with the goal of transforming the entire data system into a sufficiently strong legal basis. They began by identifying motive based on recorded file elements and behavioral analysis, examining the relationship between Thomas Harper and Evelyn Harper in the period before the disappearance, focusing on signs of tension, conflict, or behavioral changes. They analyzed old and new statements to pinpoint indicators of relational instability, including disputes over personal decisions, shifts in interaction patterns, and signs that the victim may have been preparing to leave the current living environment. These factors were synthesized to construct a context in which violent behavior could have been triggered by personal motive. Investigators relied not on speculation, but on linking each element to specific file data to ensure the reasonableness of conclusions. Concurrently, opportunity was analyzed in detail to prove Thomas Harper's capability to commit the act within the identified time and space. Investigators used the reconstructed timeline to confirm he was the only person present at the scene during the event window, with no evidence of another individual's presence. while having access to a firearm, matching the evidence, and sufficient uninterrupted time for post-event actions. These factors were cross-referenced with supplemental witness data on sounds and vehicle movements, creating alignment between opportunity and event progression, thereby reinforcing that the behavior not only could have occurred but did occur under those specific conditions. Next, investigators focused on concealment behavior as a key prosecution component, synthesizing data related to scene alteration, body wrapping, and transport to the burial site. These elements were analyzed as deliberate actions to avoid detection, using living area materials for wrapping demonstrated exploitation of available resources, while selecting an isolated yet quickly accessible burial site indicated terrain knowledge and planning ability. Additionally, providing misleading information and sustaining an alternative narrative over time was viewed as part of the concealment strategy. Investigators linked these actions into a post-event behavioral model in which each step served to reduce detection risk and delay investigation. With motive, opportunity, and concealment behavior identified and connected, investigators conducted an overall assessment to determine whether the file met the probable cause threshold. They reviewed each evidence group including scene data, remains forensic results, related physical evidence, and witness statements to ensure every conclusion drew support from multiple independent sources. Thomas's statement contradictions were contextualized within physical data, while supplemental witness statements confirmed timeline elements. The entire evidence system was organized to demonstrate sufficient reasonable grounds to believe Thomas Harper committed the crime, not based on any single factor, but on the combination of many forming a logical and consistent chain. This process included standardizing the file to legal requirements, presenting data in a clear structure, detailing interconnections among elements, and identifying potential weaknesses to prepare for cross-examination. Once the prosecution file had been constructed with full elements of motive, opportunity, and concealment behavior, the investigative team proceeded to the next step of compiling all established evidence into a complete system for obtaining an arrest warrant. They re-reviewed each data group, including the original scene, remains analysis results, related evidence, and all old and new witness statements, placing every element in direct relation to the identified event chain. Investigators ensured no detail stood alone, but all interconnected into a logical structure. Physical scene traces connected to skeletal injuries, wrapping materials linked to suspect property, and witness statements used to confirm time points and movement behavior. The full evidence system was rechecked for consistency and to eliminate any contradictions that could weaken the file. After completing the synthesis, investigators evaluated the necessary legal threshold for prosecution, cross-referencing evidence against the probable cause standard, which requires sufficient reasonable grounds to believe a crime occurred and the targeted individual was directly involved. This process went beyond confirming evidence existence to assessing mutual support among elements. They determined the existing data not only showed violent behavior occurred, but indicated a deliberate sequence tied to Thomas Harper from enclosed space firearm use, body wrapping, and transport, to providing misleading information for concealment. These combined factors formed a foundation strong enough to meet the current legal probable cause threshold. On that basis, the team began drafting the arrest warrant application, constructing the document in a rigorous legal structure with each evidence section clearly presented and accompanied by explanations of its linkages to other case elements. Investigators ensured the language was precise, non-speculative, and accurately reflective of the data. Every time point, location, and action was specifically described to create a comprehensive picture for reviewers. The file was then submitted to the prosecutor for independent review and evaluation. The prosecutor examined each section to ensure presented evidence met legal requirements and could be used in proceedings. During this, some points required further clarification, including emphasizing the link between wrapping materials and suspect property, as well as clearer presentation of how supplemental witness statements supported the established timeline. The investigative team revised the content accordingly, adding necessary details and adjusting presentation for clarity and persuasiveness. After completing revisions, the file was submitted to the competent judge for approval of the arrest warrant. The judge reviewed the entire document, assessing whether the evidence sufficiently met the probable cause standard, including verifying data source validity, linkage consistency, and the persuasiveness of the presented event chain. Upon completing the review, the judge determined the file fully met legal requirements and signed the official arrest warrant for Thomas Harper, marking the transition from investigation to law enforcement execution based on established evidence. Investigators developed a detailed plan to approach and secure the suspect. organizing an internal briefing to clearly assign tasks to each team member and determine an approach method suited to actual conditions at Thomas Harper's residence. Factors such as house structure, entry/exit points, distances to neighboring structures, and the suspect's potential response were analyzed to ensure the arrest proceeded safely and effectively. The team also considered various scenarios, including possible resistance, escape attempts, or evidence destruction, developing corresponding contingency plans. Concurrently, they confirmed the suspect's current location through available sources including residency data, daily routines, and recent observations from those nearby. Verification results showed the suspect present at his familiar residence with no signs of recent unusual movement, facilitating on-site arrest implementation. On that basis, enforcement personnel were mobilized and positioned at pre-assigned locations, with units assigned to control main approach routes to prevent any departure from the area while ensuring no external interference affected execution. The timing was selected based on situational control assessment to minimize risk and prevent unanticipated suspect reactions. Once forces were in position, the approach was executed in a controlled manner. Investigators entered Thomas Harper's residence area and quickly established presence to limit suspect mobility. Thomas was located in the main living space with no signs of preparation for confrontation. Forces secured the suspect according to protocol, achieving complete control of his actions without significant conflict. Restraint measures were applied only as necessary to ensure safety for both personnel and suspect. After securing the suspect, investigators clearly informed him of the arrest warrant, specifying the arrest grounds based on established evidence and explaining his legal rights per regulations. Thomas Harper was advised of his right to remain silent, right to an attorney, and other relevant rights. The entire process was fully documented to ensure procedural legality. The suspect's initial reactions were observed and recorded, including attitude, level of cooperation, and any initial statements. Subsequently, the suspect was removed from the residence under close enforcement supervision, with transport conducted per standard protocol to prevent incidents during movement. After Thomas Harper was transported to the investigative agency and intake procedures completed, the team moved to the interrogation phase with the objective of clarifying identified file contradictions and testing the suspect's ability to maintain his statements against the strengthened evidence system. They began by comparing statements Thomas provided in 1952 with current data, using archived records to extract each detail from his initial account, including descriptions of the last sighting of Evelyn Harper, daily activities on the disappearance day, and references to the unfamiliar man he mentioned. These contents were placed alongside the timeline reconstructed from new data, revealing inconsistencies in timing and event sequence. Investigators presented each time point specifically, requiring Thomas to confirm or explain differences, thereby creating a foundation to test statement stability when confronted with verified data. Next, internal contradictions in the suspect's statements were systematically presented. Investigators pointed out that details regarding an external individual's appearance lacked any witness confirmation, while no vehicle traces matched the initial description. They cross-referenced this with scene survey and search results showing no evidence supporting third-party involvement. When Thomas was asked to explain these deficiencies, his responses were recorded to assess statement consistency and adaptability. Investigators continued clarifying differences between his prior accounts and what current data could prove, progressively narrowing acceptable explanation ranges. Concurrently with highlighting contradictions, the team presented the constructed evidence chain from the reinvestigation. They sequentially introduced data from the original scene, remains analysis results, and post-event behavioral elements, explaining linkages among groups to form a closed logical sequence. Investigators describe how scene traces indicated enclosed space violence, how skeletal injuries matched the seized firearm, and how body wrapping materials originated from the suspect's living area. These were presented not as isolated facts, but as components of an overall structure to demonstrate no reasonable alternative explanation existed beyond actions directly involving Thomas Harper. To enhance interrogation effectiveness, investigators employed timeline-based questioning tactics, guiding the exchange from early disappearance day time points, progressing to critical periods such as the violence window, body transport phase, and subsequent concealment actions. Each question was designed to force the suspect to confront specific details, limiting vague or evasive responses. When Thomas answered, investigators immediately cross-referenced with existing data to assess fit. If discrepancies appeared, they returned to prior time points for clarification. creating continuous verification to detect statement weaknesses. Psychological pressure was increased through logical confrontation between data and statements. Investigators avoided coercive measures, instead focusing on clear, consistent presentation of interconnections, making gaps in the suspect's explanations more evident. They emphasized that evidence did not stand alone, but mutually supported each other, and any statement inconsistent with part of the system would undermine the entire narrative the suspect attempted to maintain. This process was repeated with variations of the same questions to test statement stability under pressure while observing changes in Thomas's responses over time. Throughout the interrogation, investigators continuously recorded changes in the suspect's attitude and statements, noting indicators such as hesitation, shifts in phrasing, contradictions between answers at different points, and any adjustments to the original story. These changes were detailed and cross-referenced with interrogation timeline points to determine when and under what context they emerged, providing additional data to evaluate statement reliability while supporting potential supplemental evidence file construction if needed. The changes in reactions and gradual weakening of prior arguments created a clear turning point in the interrogation process as investigators continued cross-referencing each detail of the statements. With the established evidence chain, Thomas Harper began acknowledging his role in the incident, initially with limited confirmations before progressively moving to direct admissions of the criminal act. He confirmed that the matter did not involve any external individual as previously claimed, but occurred entirely within the confines of the house. Investigators asked him to recount the sequence of events chronologically, from the time Evelyn Harper returned home until the violent act occurred. Thomas described an escalating conflict in the main living space over accumulated personal issues, with rising tension leading him to use a firearm readily available in the house. These details were recorded and cross-checked against previously collected evidence positions, including shell casing locations and shooting direction determined through scene analysis. When asked to clarify the precise location of the act, Thomas confirmed the area in the house where investigators had noted impact signs and primary evidence concentration as the site of the incident, describing his and the victim's relative positions in that space in a manner consistent with prior conclusions on shooting direction and shooter position. Investigators further requested clarification on the number of shots fired and the manner of action. Thomas provided information about multiple shots in a short period, compatible with the quantity and distribution of collected shell casings, thereby further reinforcing the connection between the confession and physical data. After confirming the violent sequence, investigators shifted to requiring Thomas to describe post-act body handling. He admitted that after the incident, he took actions to conceal the body within the same space, including using available household materials for wrapping. Thomas described the type of material used and where he obtained it, details matching the materials recovered with the remains. Investigators continued asking him to describe moving the body out of the living area. Thomas stated he used his personal vehicle to transport the body to a location some distance from the house, choosing nighttime to reduce detection risk, and described the travel route and method of removing the body from the vehicle to the burial site. This information was cross-referenced with re-investigation data on movement traces. Continuing the interrogation, investigators requested more detailed description of the final concealment method at the burial location. Thomas admitted selecting terrain suitable to minimize detection, using available tools to create sufficient space for the body, then covering it with on-site natural materials. Details on depth, relative position, and body arrangement were recorded and compared to excavation results, showing alignment between the statement and reality. Investigators further probed supplemental information, including his handling of related items post-incident, return to normal routine, and maintenance of the original story over many years. Thomas provided details on preserving certain scene elements to avoid drawing attention while adjusting statements to explain the victim's absence without direct suspicion. This information was cross-checked against the original investigation file, showing consistency between actual behavior and past presentations. Throughout the confession process, investigators continuously verified the accuracy of provided details by cross-referencing with existing data, immediately requiring clarification of any inconsistencies to ensure the final statement accurately reflected the events, while further strengthening the previously built evidence chain. Confession recording followed protocol, including confirmation that the suspect provided the statement voluntarily and understood his rights, with the entire content documented in the file. The formal prosecution process was initiated with charges against the suspect for murder, based on the complete evidence system established throughout the decades-long investigation. The indictment was constructed in a rigorous structure, organizing each element from the original scene, remains forensic results, recovered evidence, and suspect statements into a logical chain proving the full criminal sequence from beginning to end. When the trial began, the prosecutor presented the case chronologically, starting with reconstruction of the 1952 scene showing enclosed space violence indicators including shell casing distribution, shooting direction, and impact areas, followed by analyses ruling out external occurrence, then moving to presentation of the remains discovered during reinvestigation, where trauma characteristics, wrapping materials, and burial location reinforced a hypothesis that the victim was killed in the house and subsequently moved elsewhere for concealment. The centerpiece of the presentation was Thomas Harper's confession, used as a connecting axis to tie all facts together. The prosecutor sequentially cross-referenced each confession detail with physical evidence, pointing out that the suspect's description of the conflict location matched the shell casing concentration area, the number of shots aligned with collected evidence quantity. Body wrapping method corresponded to materials found at the burial site, and described travel route fit the remains discovery location. Forensic experts and investigators were called to explain evidence collection and analysis methods, thereby reinforcing the reliability of conclusions while proving the confession was not a standalone statement, but supported by a consistent data system. During the trial, defense counsel focused on questioning evidence validity, particularly the long time gap between the event and remains discovery, arguing that early scene and evidence preservation might not meet modern standards, thus affecting later analysis accuracy. Additionally, they challenged the interrogation process, suggesting psychological pressure may have influenced the confession and proposing consideration that the statement might not fully reflect truth, aiming to create reasonable doubt about evidence linkages and the suspect's role. In response, the prosecutor continued strengthening the case structure by emphasizing the independence and mutual support of evidence sources, pointing out that even separating the confession, scene, remains, and witness data still formed a system pointing to the same conclusion. Combined with the confession, the system became complete with no logical gaps. The prosecutor detailed interrogation procedures, including assurance of the suspect's legal rights and statement recording methods, to prove the confession was voluntary and admissible in court. They further cross-referenced specific details provided by the suspect, stressing that much information in the confession could only be known by someone directly involved in the act, thereby enhancing the confession's reliability as central evidence. Trial presentations were organized to reconstruct the full event chain coherently from victim disappearance, initial investigation, stalled period, to file reopening and remains discovery, each step linked to specific evidence and corresponding statements, enabling the jury to follow and evaluate the entire case in a clear structure. Litigation focused on determining whether this evidence chain was strong enough to overcome reasonable doubt, with each side presenting arguments and rebuttals based on the same data system but differing interpretations. The entire trial proceedings reflected continuous confrontation between evidence and arguments to reach a final legal conclusion. After the extended litigation process involving presentation and cross-examination of the complete evidence system before the court, the case moved to deliberation, where the jury evaluated each presented element. They examined data from the original scene, remains forensic results, witness statement chain, and particularly Thomas Harper's confession in relation to the overall case structure. Each piece of evidence was analyzed not only for content, but for its degree of connection to other evidence. The jury assessed whether these facts combined to form a consistent logical chain. They considered the prosecution's arguments that physical scene traces aligned with confession descriptions while weighing defense challenges regarding analysis reliability and statement validity. This process proceeded by eliminating alternative explanations, checking whether any reasonable scenario existed beyond the suspect committing the act. Jury members sequentially cross-referenced key case points from the timing of violent behavior, body handling and concealment methods, to long-term maintenance of misleading information, to determine fit between evidence and charges. Upon completing evaluation, the jury reached a conclusion on Thomas Harper's criminal responsibility based on the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, determining the presented evidence formed a complete system with no significant gaps undermining the criminal conduct conclusion. The suspect's confession was viewed as a central but not sole element, reinforced by physical data and witness statements. The alignment among these evidence sources was deemed sufficient to establish that murder occurred and the suspect bore direct responsibility. On that basis, a guilty verdict was announced in court, reflecting the outcome of comprehensive evidence and argument evaluation. After the verdict, the court proceeded to apply the sentencing framework per legal provisions, determining the sentence based on the nature of the act, severity level, and factors related to prolonged concealment. These elements were considered to ensure the punishment accurately reflected the suspect's criminal responsibility degree. The sentence was imposed within statutory limits, marking the transition from guilt determination to punishment execution, with the full judgment officially recorded in the case file as part of the complete legal process. Sentencing simultaneously confirmed the legal conclusion of the case, with relevant agencies completing necessary procedures to close the file. All documents from initial investigation, reopening, evidence collection, interrogation, and trial were archived per regulations, reflecting the entire progression from victim disappearance to criminal responsibility determination and handling. File closure held not only administrative significance, but also marked completion of resolving a decades-long case in which past unclear elements were addressed through application of modern, investigative and analytical methods, yielding a clear legal conclusion based on a verified evidence system. If you want to follow more cold cases solved through modern investigation, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like Evelyn Harper's. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video with another unresolved file waiting to be clarified.